On a crisp March afternoon, the bustling streets of Hartford thrummed with life, a chaotic symphony of vendors calling out prices, teenagers erupting in carefree laughter near the old stone fountain, and a lone guitarist strumming a soulful tune that floated above the crowd. Officer Mike Callahan strode through this vibrant scene on Main Street, his heavy boots striking the pavement with a rhythm that spoke of intent bordering on menace. His sharp, hawk-like eyes darted from face to face, dissecting every interaction with a scrutiny honed by 20 years on the force. To Mike, this wasn't just a patrol, it was a performance, a stage where he brandished his authority like a gleaming sword, cutting through the disorder he perceived around him. 2 decades had forged him into a man both meticulous and unyielding. His reputation whispered in precinct hallways as a cop who never bent, never softened. Lately, though, the city's rising tide of petty crime spurred by a chorus of public complaints had lit a fire under him. He was in overdrive, every shadow a suspect, every stranger a threat to the order he swore to protect. Mike didn't see himself as prejudiced. In his mind, he was Hartford's sentinel, a lone guardian standing against the chaos he blamed on outsiders, those he believed clogged the streets with their unfamiliar faces and unearned presence. The memory of a recent arrest gnawed at him. A young immigrant, detained on flimsy grounds, had sparked murmurs of misconduct among the locals. The whispers had reached his ears, but he'd dismissed them with a flick of his hand, certain the law shielded him like armor. Yet the backlash lingered, a splinter under his skin, feeding a quiet resentment that simmered beneath his steely exterior. As he rounded the corner into the lively plaza, his gaze snagged on a figure that stood out amid the crowd, a woman whose poised confidence seemed to challenge the very air he breathed. Rachel Carter stood beside a vendor's cart, her slender fingers flipping through a folder of papers with the ease of someone who knew exactly what she held. Her natural curls framed a face that glowed with quiet strength, her polished Atiria-tailored blazer and crisp blouse hinting at a life of purpose and success. She wasn't just another face in the throng. She moved with a deliberate grace, as if the world bent to accommodate her presence. To the vendor, she offered a warm smile, a light laugh spilling from her lips as they traded small talk about the day's offerings. It was a fleeting, ordinary momentum, light glinting off the apples on the cart, the faint scent of fresh bread wafting through the air, but to Mike, it was a spark to dry tinder. His mind, shaped by years of unchecked power and buried biases, churned with suspicion. Another one trying to game the system, he muttered under his breath, his hand tightening on the worn leather of his belt. To him, Hartford wasn't her place, not in the way he saw it, not with her dark skin and self-assured stride. Rachel didn't notice him at first, her focus on the vendor's cheerful banter. But Mike's approach was impossible to ignore. His broad shoulders squared, his badge catching the light. He closed the distance with steps that echoed like a drumbeat against the cobblestones. "Ma'am," he barked, his voice a jagged blade slicing through the plaza's hum. "Do you have a permit to conduct business here?" The words hit Rachel like a cold gust, her head snapping up, brows knitting in confusion. "Excuse me," she replied, her tone steady but tinged with disbelief. "I'm not conducting business." Mike's eyes narrowed, his patience already fraying. "I don't need excuses," he snapped, jabbing a finger at the folder in her hands. "What's in there?" "Identification, permits, hand it over." Rachel straightened, her posture a silent defiance, though her heart gave a quick, uneasy thud. "This is my work folder," she said firmly, her voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "I don't see how it concerns you, officer." Mike's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath his weathered skin. "Hand it over," he repeated, his tone dropping to a growl. "Refusal to comply can lead to consequences." The air thickened with tension, a ripple of unease spreading through the nearby crowd. Pedestrians slowed their steps, heads turning, eyes widening as the confrontation unfolded. Rachel's mind raced. Is he doing this? What's his angle? But she sensed the futility of resistance. With a reluctant breath, she extended the folder, her grip lingering a moment before releasing it into his grasp. Mike snatched it without a word, his movements rough and impatient. He flipped through the contents, contracts, memos, a neatly printed work, Prometheus eyes scanning each page with theatrical disdain. For a fleeting second, it seemed the encounter might end there. A petty power play resolved by proof of her legitimacy. But then his lips twisted into a smirk, a dark glint flickering in his gaze. He held up the work permit, turning it in the light as if inspecting a counterfeit bill. Before his fingers tightened and dripped tore it in half, the sound of shredding paper cut through the plaza like a gunshot. Silencing the chatter around them, Rachel lurched forward, her voice breaking free in a rush of shock and fury. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, her hands trembling with the effort to hold herself together. "Operating without proper documentation is a violation," Mike said, his tone smug, almost gleeful. As he tossed the torn pieces to the ground, they fluttered down like fallen leaves, landing in a puddle near the vendor's cart. "That's a legal document," Rachel shot back, her voice rising, sharp and unyielding. "You have no right." "I have every right," Mike interrupted, stepping closer, his shadow swallowing the sunlight around her. "If you're here without paperwork, you'll answer for it." Her outrage boiled over, her fists clenching at her sides as she fought the urge to scream. Around them, the crowd stirred murmurs growing into a low hum, phones emerging from pockets to capture the scene. The vendor, a weary man with graying hair, shrank back, his eyes darting between Rachel and Mike. Torn between fear and a flicker of indignation he didn't dare voice. "You're abusing your authority," Rachel said, her voice steady now, though it trembled with suppressed rage. "This is harassment, and you know it." Mike's expression darkened, his bravado a thin mask over the unease creeping into his chest. "Take it up with the precinct, ma'am," he replied coldly. "But until then, I suggest you cooperate." The plaza seemed to hold its breath, the weight of their standoff pressing down like a storm cloud. Rachel's mind spun years of navigating subtle slights and overt injustices flashed before her, each one a brick in the wall of resilience she'd built. Yet this felt different, rawer, a blatant misuse of power that stripped away her dignity in front of a growing audience. Before she could respond, a low rumble broke the tension. A sleek black SUV glided to a stop at the plaza's edge, its tinted windows gleaming under the afternoon sun. Mike's head turned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. The driver's door swung open and out stepped Daniel Carter, Rachel's husband. His tailored suit hugged a frame that exuded quiet power, his every movement deliberate, commanding. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached, his dark eyes locking onto Mike with an intensity that could freeze fire. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked, his voice smooth, but laced with a steel edge that silenced the murmurs around them. Mike straightened, his chest puffing out, though his usual swagger faltered under Daniel's unflinching stare. "And you are?" he demanded, clinging to his authority like a lifeline. Daniel took another step, his presence filling the space between them. "The husband of the woman you just harassed," he said, his tone hardening. "Care to explain yourself, officer?" Rachel's eyes met her husband's, a silent current of strength passing between them. Relief, solidarity, a shared resolve. The balance of power shifted, the air crackling with the unspoken promise of consequences. Mike's bravado wavered, his mind scrambling to recalibrate. He'd misjudged her, misjudged them. Daniel Carter wasn't just any man, it was one of Hartford's elite, a figure whose influence stretched through the city's corridors of power like roots through soil. The vendor, emboldened by the shift, muttered under his breath, "About time someone stood up to him." A teenage girl filming nearby whispered to her friend, "This is going virally, can feel it." The crowd's energy swelled, a tide turning against the officer who'd ruled these streets with an iron fist. In that moment, Mike's world tilted. He'd wielded his badge as a weapon, believing it made him untouchable, but now the weight of his actions bore down on him. Justice, he'd always thought, was his to Anfresiah. Here it stood, staring back at him in the form of a woman he'd underestimated, and a man who could unravel his career with a single phone call. Rachel's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts, firm and unyielding. "You'll hear from us, officer. This isn't over." The lesson hung heavy in the air. Power, when abused, invites its own reckoning, and the consequences of crossing that line ripple far beyond the moment of arrogance. For Mike, the storm brewing within him was just beginning, a tempest of accountability he could no longer outrun. Under the harsh glare of the afternoon sun, Officer Mike Callahan stood in the bustling plaza, his fingers rifling through a worn folder stuffed with papers. His sharp, hawk-like eyes darted over the contents-scorporate memos, scribbled meeting notes, and, most crucially, Rachel's work permit. Each page he turned fueled the disdain simmering beneath his stern expression, a twisted satisfaction curling his lips into a smirk. It was as though he were a predator circling prey, hunting for any scrap of evidence, any flaw, to legitimize the authority he wielded like a blunt weapon. He paused, his thick fingers snagging on the work permit, and yanked it free with a flourish, holding it aloft as if it were a trophy won in some petty conquest. "Here we go," he muttered, his voice dripping with smugness, the words rolling off his tongue like a taunt. Rachel, standing just a few feet away, felt her stomach twist as she watched him brandish the document. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest, a mix of indignation and dread swelling within her. She stepped forward, her boots clicking sharply against the stone tiles of the plaza, her voice cutting through the air with unwavering resolve. "It's perfectly valid," she said, her tone steady despite the tremor of anger threatening to break through. "I've had that permit for years, sires of hard work you're holding in your hands." Her dark eyes locked onto his, daring him to contradict her, though beneath her defiance lingered a quiet fear of what he might do next. Mike barely acknowledged her words, his broad shoulders squared as he tilted his head, his condescension palpable in the way he waved her off like an annoying fly. "Well, we'll just see about that," he drawled, his voice thick with arrogance. Before Rachel could muster another protest, he acted. With a slow, deliberate motion, he gripped the permit between his calloused hands and tore it apart. The sharp, grating sound of ripping paper sliced through the hum of the plaza, a jagged noise that seemed to freeze time itself. The two halves fluttered to the ground like wounded birds, landing in a pitiful heap at his feet. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her composure fracturing as shock and fury collided within her. "What the hell are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising, raw and unrestrained, echoing across the open space. Mike's smirk widened, his arms crossing over his chest as he leaned back slightly, basking in his petty triumph. "Operating without valid documentation is a violation," he said, his tone smug and self-assured, as if he'd just delivered an irrefutable verdict. The shredded pieces lay scattered on the ground, a stark symbol of his disregard, and he stood over them like a conqueror, daring her to push back. The crowd around him, a loose circle of onlookers drawn by the commotion, watched in uneasy silence, their murmurs barely audible over the pounding of Rachel's pulse in her ears. "That was a legal document," Rachel exclaimed, stepping closer, her voice trembling with a fury she fought to contain. Inside, she felt the heat of humiliation scorching her chest, but she refused to let it consume her. She was no stranger to standing her ground. She had built her career on it, but this was different. This was personal, a direct assault on her dignity, and the weight of it pressed against her ribs like a vice. "You've crossed a line," she said, her words sharp and measured, each syllable laced with the restraint of someone who knew the stakes of losing control. Mike raised a hand, cutting her off mid-breath, his expression hardening. "I'm the one who decides where the lines are," he snapped, his gaze sweeping over the growing crowd. Some had pulled out their phones, their screens glinting as they recorded the scene, a quiet rebellion against his authority. He shot them a withering glare, but it lacked the conviction to deter them. If anything, their scrutiny only seemed to embolden him, though a faint sheen of sweat glistened at his temples, betraying the cracks in his bravado. Rachel drew a shaky breath, her hands curling into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms as she wrestled with the storm inside her. "You're abusing your power, and you know it," she said, her voice low but resolute, cutting through the tension like a blade. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, their silent judgment amplifying her words. Yet she stood alone in her defiance. Mike shrugged, unfazed, his lips twitching into a dismissive sneer. "Take it up with the precinct if you want," he said, his tone casual, almost bored. "But I suggest you cooperate unless you want this to get worse." The air grew thick with unease, the plaza's usual chatter replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. A man in his 30s, standing near the edge of the crowd, leaned toward his friend, his voice a hushed whisper. "This isn't right," he said, his brow furrowed with discomfort. Yet no one moved, no one intervened. The weight of Mike's badge's small, gleaming shield pinned to his chest held them all at bay, a silent reminder of the power he wielded and the consequences of crossing it. Rachel bent down, her knees trembling slightly as she gathered the torn pieces of her permit from the ground. Her fingers brushed the rough edges of the paper, and the sting of humiliation burned hotter. Threatening to spill over into tears she refused to shed, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Rising to her feet, she clutched the fragments tightly, her jaw set with determination. "This isn't over," she said, her voice a quiet vow, steady despite the tremor in her hands. Mike leaned in, his smirk fading into something colder, more menacing. "You're right," he replied, his tone laced with mockery. "It's not." His words hung between them, a dark promise that sent a chill down her spine. Before either could say more, the low rumble of an engine broke through the standoff, drawing every eye in the plaza. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop just a few feet away, its polished surface catching the sunlight in a dazzling gleam. The vehicle exuded an air of quiet authority, its presence alone shifting the atmosphere. The driver's door swung open and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out. Daniel Carter moved with the precision of someone accustomed to command, his tailored suit crisp against the chaos of the scene. His face was calm, almost serene, but there was a steel beneath it, an unspoken intensity that radiated from his measured steps. Rachel's eyes met his, and a flood of emotion surged through her, relief at his arrival, tension from the ordeal, and a flicker of hope that this nightmare might end. Daniel's gaze shifted to Mike, his expression unreadable yet piercing, like a storm gathering on the horizon. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled, each word deliberate as he approached. Mike straightened, his posture stiffening as he sized up the newcomer, his earlier confidence wavering for a fleeting moment. "Who are you?" he demanded, his tone sharp with suspicion. Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm her husband," he said simply, nodding toward Rachel. His voice remained steady, but an edge crept into it, a quiet warning that sliced through the murmur of the crowd. Mike's jaw tightened, his defensiveness flaring. "Well, your wife here was found without proper documentation," he said, his words clipped. "She's in violation." "That's a lie," Rachel interjected, her voice regaining its strength as she turned to Daniel. Her words tumbled out in a rush, urgent and precise. "He tore up my work permit, me legal permit, for no reason." She held up the shredded pieces, her hands trembling slightly as she fought to keep her composure. Daniel's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed her words. He turned back to Mike, his tone sharpening like a blade. "You tore up her legal document. On what grounds?" Mike hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face before he masked it with bravado. "It didn't look valid," he said, his voice firm but hollow. Daniel's brows lifted, his tone rising just enough to sting. "And you thought it was your job to destroy it?" Mike bristled, sweat beading at his temples. "I was following protocol," he shot back, though the words rang false, a desperate grasp at justification. Daniel stepped closer, his presence towering over Mike, casting a shadow that seemed to shrink the officer's bravado. "You're abusing your authority," he said, his voice low and lethal, each word weighted with accusation. "You're not just harassing an innocent woman, you are humiliating yourself and this entire department." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, emboldened by Daniel's unwavering stance. Phones remained raised, their lenses capturing every tense second, a silent jury bearing witness to the unraveling scene. Mike opened his mouth to retort, but the words faltered, caught in his throat. For the first time, he seemed to feel the shift power slipping from his grasp, the crowd's judgment pressing in. Daniel turned to Rachel, his tone softening, though his eyes still burned with resolve. "Are you okay?" She nodded, her jaw clenched tight. "I'm fine," she said, gesturing to the torn permit in her hand. "But this isn't." Daniel's gaze hardened as he faced Mike again. "This isn't over," he said, his voice echoing Rachel's earlier defiance. "Not by a long shot." The plaza buzzed with electric tension, the air crackling as the confrontation teetered on the edge. Mike, for all his bluster, found himself outmatched in it just by Daniel's composure, but by the weight of justice beginning to tip against him. The lesson was clear: Power, when abused, carried consequences that no badge could shield. And as the crowd watched, their silence spoke volumes, a collective demand for accountability that would not be ignored. The air in the plaza was thick with tension, a simmering heat that seemed to pulse through the gathered crowd. Officer Mike Callahan stood rigid, his broad shoulders squared as he faced Rachel Carter, his jaw tightening with every passing second. His eyes, once steady with the confidence of authority, now flickered with something darker, irritation, perhaps, or the slow burn of defiance. "I've done my job, ma'am," he said, his voice clipped and cold, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. "If you've got a problem with how the law works, that's on you, not me." His tone carried the weight of someone who believed his badge was an impenetrable shield, a justification for every action, no matter how reckless. Rachel stood her ground, her posture unyielding despite the storm brewing around her. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the fury coursing through her veins. She could still feel the sting of humiliation from moments earlier, when Mike had snatched her work permit from her grasp and torn it to shreds with a smirk, as if her rights were nothing more than paper to be discarded. Now, as his dismissive words hung in the air, her hazel eyes narrowed, sharp with resolve. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch, a quiet rebellion against his arrogance. Before she could speak, Daniel Carter stepped forward, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. Tall and lean, with a face hardened by years of standing up to men like Mike, he moved with a calm that belied the fire in his chest. His voice, when it came, was razor sharp, slicing through the officer's bravado. "No, officer, the problem isn't the law, it's you," he said, his words deliberate, each one laced with accusation. "You shredded a legal document without cause, harassed my wife in broad daylight, and now you're standing here pretending you didn't cross every line imaginable. That's not duty. That's abuse." His dark eyes locked onto Mike's, unflinching, daring him to push further. The crowd around them stirred, their murmurs swelling into a restless hum. What had started as a routine interaction, a simple ID check in the bustling plaza, had spiraled into something raw and volatile. People shifted on their feet, some craning their necks for a better view, others clutching their phones with white-knuckled grips, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. The sunlight glinted off dozens of screens, each one a tiny window into a moment that would soon ripple far beyond this dusty square. Mike's composure frayed at the edges, his patience unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. He whirled toward a young man in the crowd, a lanky figure with tousled hair, and a nervous energy. Woe held his phone aloft, recording the scene. "Put that away," Mike barked, his voice booming with authority as he took a menacing step forward. The young man flinched, his sneakers scuffing the pavement as he stumbled back, but he didn't lower the device. His hands shook, betraying his fear, yet his voice emerged steady, defiant. "I've got every right to film this," he said, the slight quiver in his tone overshadowed by a stubborn courage. "This is public. You don't get to stop me." Mike's face darkened, a storm cloud rolling over his features. "Not when it's interfering with police work," he snapped, lunging forward, his hand darting toward the phone. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath as the young man jerked backward, clutching his device to his chest like a lifeline. Mike's fingers grazed the air, missing their target, and the failure only fueled his frustration. His chest heaved, his once polished uniform now wrinkled with the strain of his unraveling control. The eyes of the onlookers bore into him, their judgment a tangible weight pressing down on his shoulders. Daniel moved in an instant, stepping between Mike and the young man with the grace of someone who'd faced down bullies before. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and firm, a command wrapped in velvet. "You've already gone too far. Don't dig yourself a deeper hole." His stance was unyielding, a wall of quiet strength, and for a moment, the plaza seemed to hold its breath. Mike's face flushed a deep crimson, anger and shame warring across his rugged features. "Stay out of this," he spat, his words dripping with venom. But there was a crack in his bravado now, a hint of uncertainty. "No," Daniel replied, his tone icy, cutting through the heat of the moment. "You don't get to silence people who are calling you out. Not anymore." The two men stood locked in a silent standoff, the air between them electric, charged with unspoken challenges. Mike's hand twitched at his side, his fingers curling as if itching to reclaim the dominance slipping through his grasp. But the growing forest of phone cameras, the murmurs of the crowd, and Daniel's unwavering gaze held him in check, a predator cornered by its own missteps. Rachel stepped forward then, her presence a quiet thunder beside her husband. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady, but laced with a sharpness that cut deeper than any shout. "You've humiliated yourself, officer," she said, her words slow and deliberate, each one a nail in the coffin of his authority. "You've shamed your department, and soon enough, the whole world will see it for what it is." Her eyes glinted with a mix of anger and triumph. A woman who'd been pushed too far and had found her footing in the fight. Mike opened his mouth, a retort forming on his lips, but it withered under the weight of the moment. The cameras, the crowd, the unyielding resolve of Daniel and Rochelle, it all crashed down on him like a tidal wave. For the first time, his badge felt less like a symbol of power and more like a flimsy piece of tin, incapable of shielding him from the consequences of his actions. Daniel leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the force of a shout. "Here's how this ends," he said, his breath steady, his words lethal. "You're going to stop this nonsense right now. Then you're going to face what you've done. If you think you're walking away from this clean, you're living in a fantasy." Mike stared at him, his breath ragged, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. The crowd was no longer just onlookers, they were witnesses, their phones transforming them into a chorus of silent judges. Without another word, Mike turned sharply on his heel, his boots striking the pavement with a hollow thud as he stormed off. His back was stiff, his pride wounded, but the confrontation had ended, at least for now. Daniel turned to Rachel, his hand finding her shoulder, a gentle anchor in the chaos. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening, concern etching lines into his brow. She nodded, though her jaw remained tight, her anger still simmering beneath the surface. "I'll be fine," she said, her tone resolute. "But this isn't over." Daniel met her gaze, his expression hardening with determination. "No, it's not," he agreed, "and I'll make damn sure it isn't." Around them, the crowd began to thin, their voices a tangle of outrage and disbelief as they drifted away. But the phones stayed out, their recordings already uploading to the vast expanse of the internet. The plaza might have emptied, but the story was just beginning. Within hours, the videos exploded online, a wildfire of footage from every angle. Mike tearing Rachel's permit, his sneer as he dismissed her, his lunge for the young man's phone, and the icy resolve of Daniel's stand. The raw emotion captured in those shaky clips, Rachel's quiet defiance, Daniel's steely calm, Mike's unraveling arrogance gripped the nation. By nightfall, hashtags like Justice for Rachel and Reform Hartford blazed across social media, trending nationwide as thousands of comments flooded in. The reactions were a kaleidoscope of fury and division. "He ripped up her legal document, though. Is that not a crime?" one user posted, attaching a clip of the permit's destruction, the sound of tearing paper echoing like a gunshot. Another pushed back, "Cops have it tough enough without everyone jumping down their throats. You don't know the whole story." Rachel emerged as a beacon of resilience for some, her calm strength a rallying cry against injustice, but others sneered, questioning her motives. "They're rich," one detractor wrote. "Bet they're just spinning this for sympathy with their money." The tide shifted irrevocably when a whistleblower from the Hartford Police Department dropped a bombshell, leaked to a local journalist. The report painted a grim portrait of Mike Callahan, a man with a history of excessive force, reprimanded twice but never punished. His complaints of racial bias swept under the rug by higher-ups. Colleagues whispered about his habit of targeting minority communities, a pattern buried in hushed tones until now. The journalist's story hit like a thunderclap, complete with screenshots of internal memos and blurred witness accounts. The headline screamed, "Officer at center of viral video has history of misconduct." The backlash was swift and unrelenting. Protests erupted outside the Hartford PD, a sea of signs demanding accountability as chance of no justice. No peace reverberated through the streets. On television, pundits dissected every frame of the footage, turning the plaza confrontation into a national reckoning. "This isn't just about Rachel Carter," one commentator declared, her voice ringing with conviction. It's about a system that lets men like Mike Callahan run unchecked, year after year. It's about justice denied. Others fought back, a retired police chief growling. Armchair critics don't get it. Officers make split-second calls with half the facts. The debate fractured communities, igniting fierce arguments about power, race, and the role of law enforcement. Online, the divide deepened. Rachel as a victim of overreach, or Mike as a scapegoat for a thankless job. Amid the chaos, Rachel and Daniel remained silent, letting the footage and the public's voice carry the weight. Meanwhile, Hartford's city officials scrambled to douse the flames of outrage. Chief Karen Monroe, a reform-minded leader with a no-nonsense reputation, found herself thrust into the storm's eye. Her phone rang incessantly, community leaders demanding transparency, activists warning, "This is your chance to prove you're for justice, not the old guard. Act, or the streets won't quiet." In an emergency meeting, Monroe faced her staff, her voice steady but edged with steel. "We're under a microscope," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "If we don't respond with truth, with action, this department won't just lose trust. It'll lose everything." Outside, the protests grew louder, the videos replayed endlessly, and the lesson sank in. Power unchecked breeds consequence, and justice, once awakened, demands its due. As dusk painted the sky over Hartford with streaks of orange and purple, the city churned with a restless energy, a simmering pot ready to boil over. The air was thick with the weight of betrayal, the kind that seeps into the bones of a community when trust shatters. Protesters lined the streets outside the police station, their voices hoarse but unwavering, clutching signs that screamed justice for Rachel and stop police abuse in bold, jagged letters. Their face some tear-streaked, others hardened with resolve reflected a shared fury that had been brewing for years, now ignited by the viral videos of Rachel Carter's confrontation with Officer Mike Callahan. Inside the precinct, Chief Karen Monroe sat alone in her office, the hum of her desk lamp the only sound cutting through the silence. Her uniform, crisp and pristine, felt like armor against the storm raging beyond her walls. As the first black woman to helm the Hartford Police Department, she'd faced scrutiny before, but this was a crucible. Her dark eyes scanned the latest reports, each word a fresh wound exposing the rot within her ranks. Leaked documents had begun to surface like ghosts rising from unmarked graves, revealing a pattern of complaints swept under the rug, a culture that shielded officers while the public's faith eroded. She clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the pen in her hand. Justice, she thought, wasn't just a word, it was a promise she'd sworn to keep. The next morning, the press conference room buzzed like a hive, a chaotic symphony of clicking cameras and overlapping voices. Reporters jostled for space, their eyes sharp with hunger for the next headline. Karen stepped up to the podium, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of steel. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. Would she falter? Would she bend? Without a preamble, she launched into her statement, her voice steady and commanding. The incident involving Officer Mike Callahan and Mrs. Rachel Carter does not reflect the values of this department, she declared, her words slicing through the clamor. Effective immediately. Officer Callahan has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The room exploded, a barrage of shouted questions pelting her like hail. She raised a hand, silencing them with the authority she'd earned through years of battles. "We take these allegations seriously. This department is committed to transparency and accountability. No one, not even those sworn to uphold the law, is above it." Her tone was resolute, but beneath it, a flicker of doubt gnawed at her. Words were easy, the real test lay ahead. As she stepped away from the podium, her phone vibrated incessantly in her pocket. Calls from city officials, messages from outraged citizens. The city wasn't just watching her, it was demanding her soul. Back at the precinct, the conference room was a battlefield of its own. Karen faced a divided force, the air thick with tension that crackled like static. On one side stood officers weary of the old ways, their eyes pleading for change, their shoulders slumped under the weight of a tarnished badge. On the other, a knot of grizzled veterans, their faces etched with defiance. saw any move toward accountability as a dagger in their backs. Captain Ron Peterson, a man whose decades of service had carved deep lines into his weathered face, broke the silence first. "Chief, I respect what you're trying to do," he said, his voice gravelly but measured. "But putting Callahan on leave, it sends the wrong signal. It makes us look weak, like we're caving to the mob." His gray eyes locked onto hers, daring her to flinch. Karen didn't. "What makes us weak, Captain?" she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Is pretending misconduct doesn't exist and expecting the public to keep trusting us. That's not leadership, that's cowardice." Peterson leaned forward, his broad hands gripping the edge of the table, his tone sharpening like a blade. "Callahan's been with us for years. He's done good work. Are we really tossing him aside over some video that's got everyone riled up?" Karen's voice stayed calm, but it carried an edge of steel. "This isn't about one video, Ron. It's about a pattern of culture that's gone unchecked too long. If we don't face it, we lose everything: the public, our credibility, even ourselves." Lieutenant Angela Mears, a weary woman with a quiet intensity, spoke next, her voice softer but no less piercing. "What about the rest of us, Chief? Every officer in this room is going to be under a microscope now. You think the media's stopping at Callahan? They'll dig until they've got dirt on all of us." Her brown eyes flickered with a mix of fear and frustration, her fingers nervously tapping the table. Karen folded her arms, her stance unshaken. "Then we should have nothing to hide. If we're doing our jobs with integrity, scrutiny's nothing to fear." The room fell silent, her words settling like dust after an explosion. But she wasn't done. "Let me make this clear," she said, her voice rising with a fierce clarity. "Shielding bad behavior doesn't make us strong, it makes us complicit. If anyone here can't handle being held to a higher standard, you're in the wrong line of work." Peterson exchanged a glance with another officer, a burly man with a buzz cut who mirrored his scowl, then leaned back, arms crossed in silent rebellion. Karen saw with defiance, the resentment that she didn't need their approval, she needed their obedience. That evening, alone in her office, Karen sifted through a stack of reports, the glow of her computer screen casting shadows across her tired face. Her mind churned with the day's events, the weight of her decisions pressing down like a physical force. Then, an email pinged into her inbox, the subject line stark and ominous, a word of advice. Her pulse quickened as she opened it, the brief message chilling her to the core. "Back off the Callahan case. You know how this city works. Don't make waves, or you'll regret it." Her grip tightened on her mouse, her knuckles whitening as she reread the words. Who sent this? An officer bitter about her reforms? A loyalist to Callahan? Her thoughts raced, a storm of suspicion and resolve. She forwarded it to the cyber unit. Knowing a trace might take days if it yielded anything at all. A knock jolted her from her reverie. Deputy Chief Thomas Grant stepped in, his lanky frame filling the doorway. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, shutting the door with a soft click. She handed him her phone, letting him read the threat, his brow furrowed, his easy grin fading. "This isn't random, Karen. Someone's trying to scare you off." She exhaled sharply, frustration seeping through her calm facade. "Scaring me off isn't in my nature, Thomas." He smirked, but his eyes darkened with concern. "Just be careful. You've got enemies everywhere. The old guard hates change, and the public won't settle for half measures. You're balancing on a razor's edge." She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then I'll walk it all the way to the other side." The next day, Hartford City Council chambers buzzed with a different kind of tension. Karen sat at the head of a long table, facing a room of council members whose voices clashed like swords. Councilman Derek Vaughn, a stocky man with a booming voice and a long history of backing the police, leaned forward, his tie askew. "Chief Monroe, do you realize what this case is doing to our city? Protests, media hounding us, calls to defund the department. It's chaos out there." His tone dripped with exasperation, his thick fingers drumming the table. Karen met his stare, unflinching. "Ignoring it won't fix that chaos, Councilman. The only way out is through accountability." Vaughn shook his head, his jowls quivering. "Accountability's fine, but suspending Callahan? That's throwing a good officer to the wolves to appease the crowd. You've given the media a scapegoat." her patience frayed, her voice sharpening. "Callahan's no scapegoat's a symptom of a system that's been broken for years. If we don't fix it, those protests will be the least of our worries." Councilwoman Maria Santos, a slight woman with a fire in her dark eyes, jumped in, her words crisp and urgent. "The chief's right. We can't just slap a bandage on this and call it done. Hartford deserves real change." The room erupted, voices piling atop one another in a cacophony of blame and defiance. Karen sat still, her hands clasped tight, her mind fixed on one truth. Justice wasn't a gift to be bestowed, it was a reckoning, and its consequences would ripple far beyond Hartford's borders, exposing the cost of power abused and the strength it took to confront it. The clamor in the room dwindled to a tense hush as Karen's voice sliced through the lingering echoes of raised voices and muttered frustrations. She stood tall at the head of the table, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady and piercing as it swept across the faces of the officers before her. "You all summoned me here to take charge," she declared, her words sharp yet measured, carrying the weight of authority she'd fought tooth and nail to earn. "And that's exactly what I'm doing. If anyone in this room thinks they've got a better way to steer us out of this mess, I'm all ears. But I'll be damned if I stand by and watch this department crumble from within, eaten away by cowardice and corruption." Her chest tightened as she spoke, the burden of leadership pressing down on her like a physical force, but she refused to let it show. She couldn't afford to falter, not now, not when so much hung in the balance. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Val, a weary man with a perpetual scowl etched into his weathered face, averted his eyes, his lips twitching as he grumbled something unintelligible under his breath. His fingers drummed nervously against the edge of the table, betraying the unease he tried so hard to mask with his usual bravado. Across from him, Santos, a broad-shouldered officer with a quiet strength, caught Karen's eye and offered a subtle nod, a flicker of solidarity that felt like a lifeline in the sea of skepticism surrounding her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her grounded. Later, back at the precinct, Karen retreated to a dimly lit conference room with her legal team. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and ink, the walls lined with faded posters of department mottos that now felt more like hollow promises. She leaned over a sprawl of documents, her fingers tracing the edges of reports and legal briefs as she hashed out the final details of the investigation. Every decision weighed heavily on her mind. She knew the tightrope she walked, pushed too aggressively, and the officers she relied on would turn their backs, leaving her isolated and powerless. Ease up too much, and the public, already restless and distrustful, would see her as just another cog in a broken machine. Her head throbbed with the strain of it all, but beneath the exhaustion, a fire still burned. This wasn't just about cleaning up a single mess, it was about restoring the honor of the badge, pinned to her chest, a symbol she'd once believed in with every fiber of her being. As the meeting wrapped up, Karen sank back into her chair, the creak of the worn leather echoing in the quiet room. Her legal advisors shuffled out, their footsteps fading down the hall, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Fatigue clawed at her, tugging at the edges of her resolve. But she pushed it aside. She wasn't just fighting for herself or even for the department, she was fighting for Rachel Carter, a woman whose name had become a rallying cry, a stark reminder of what happened when justice was twisted by those meant to uphold it. The lesson was clear: power unchecked bred chaos, and Karen refused to let that chaos win. Meanwhile, miles away, the studio lights blazed like miniature suns, casting harsh shadows across the sleek set of a popular evening talk show. Rachel Carter sat poised in a stiff-backed chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to steady the tremor she refused to let the audience see. Across from her, the host, a polished man with a practiced smile, leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the promise of a compelling story. Beside her sat Daniel, his posture calm and composed, though the faint tightness in his jaw hinted at the storm brewing beneath his cool exterior. Rachel's voice, when she spoke, was steady but laced with a raw passion that seemed to vibrate through the air. She recounted the incident at the plaza with painstaking care, each word deliberate, each pause heavy with meaning. "This isn't just about me," she said, leaning slightly forward. her dark eyes locking onto the camera as if she could reach through it to every viewer at home. It's about a system that lets men like Officer Callahan wield power without consequence. It's about breaking a cycle that's gone on too long, one that crushes people under its weight while pretending to protect them. The host nodded thoughtfully before turning to Daniel. As someone with a high profile in this city, do you think your family's prominence has made you a target? He asked, his tone smooth but probing. Daniel's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching faintly as he weighed his response. Prominence doesn't shield you from prejudice, he said, his voice low and firm, carrying the weight of years spent navigating a world that judged him before he even spoke. If anything, it paints a bullseye on your back. What happened to Rochelle? It's not unique to us. It could happen to anyone, anywhere. And that's exactly why we're here, laying it all bare. The audience erupted in applause as the interview drew to a close, their cheers ringing in Rachel's ears as she and Daniel stepped off the set. But beneath the noise, she felt the gravity of their words settling into her bones, a reminder that this was just one battle in a war they'd barely begun. Back at home that night, Rachel sat cross-legged on the couch, the blue glow of her phone illuminating her face. As she scrolled through a torrent of social media comments, her brow furrowed, her breath catching as the venomous words leapt off the screen. "You're just fishing for attention," one sneered, the letters practically dripping with disdain. "Callahan was doing his job, quit playing the victim." Another snapped. Her inbox was a darker abyss, brimming with messages that ranged from snide jabs to chilling threats. One email stopped her cold. "We know where you live. Shut your mouth, or you'll wish you had." Her hands trembled as she closed the message, her pulse racing, a cold sweat prickling her skin. She sensed Daniel before she heard him, his quiet footsteps pausing behind her. "Are you still reading that garbage?" he asked, his voice tight with worry, though he tried to soften it with care. "I can't just pretend it's not there," Rachel replied, turning to face him, her eyes blazing with defiance despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "This is what people think. Daniel, this is the reality we're fighting against." He frowned, his broad shoulders tensing as he stepped closer. "Giving them your energy is exactly what they want," he countered, his tone sharper now. "Let me handle it, our security team can know." She cut him off, her voice rising with a fierceness that surprised even her. "This isn't just about staying safe. It's about changing how people see this, and I can't do that by hiding." Their gazes locked, the air between them crackling with unspoken fears and stubborn resolve. Daniel exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "Rachel, I get it, but there's a line between courage and recklessness. I'm not losing you to this." The next morning, that line blurred further. A member of their security team, a burly man named Marcus with a scar tracing his left cheek, intercepted a stranger loitering near their home. The man clutched a sign scrawled with hateful slogans, his wild eyes darting as he muttered to himself. But it was the glint of a knife tucked into his waistband that sent a chill through Marcus's seasoned nerves. He detained the man with swift, practiced efficiency, calling the police as backup. By the time Daniel's phone buzzed with the news, he was halfway through a meeting downtown. He abandoned it without a second thought, his heart pounding as he sped home. He found Rachel in the living room, her expression calm, but her hands clasped tightly together as Marcus briefed them. "He didn't get close," Marcus assured them, his deep voice steady. "Cops have him now." Daniel whirled on Rachel, his fear spilling over. "This is what I've been saying. What if he'd gotten inside? What if?" "But he didn't," she interrupted, her voice even but unyielding. "And I'm not letting this stop me." His voice rose, cracking with emotion. "This isn't just about you, Rachel. It's about us, our familiar safety. You've got to see the bigger picture." Her eyes flashed, a spark of anger igniting. "I am seeing it. That's why I won't let fear gag me. If we back down, they wouldn't. You get that?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it seemed to pulse. Daniel turned away, muttering something bitter as he stalked off, leaving Rachel staring after him, her resolve unshaken but her heart aching. Later, alone in her office, Rachel replayed their clash in her mind. She understood Daniel's terror, felt it too, deep in her gut, but retreating wasn't an option. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her reverie. A text from an unknown number, Stay strong. We're with you. Simple words, but they hit her like a lifeline, reigniting the fire she'd nearly let flicker out. She opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys as she drafted a statement for their next public move. Each word a brick in the wall she was building against injustice. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was deafening. Rachel and Daniel sat across from each other, the clink of forks against plates the only sound breaking the stillness. Finally, Daniel set his fork down, his voice quiet but earnest. "I don't want to keep fighting you." She looked up, her expression softening, the hard edges of her determination giving way to something gentler. "I don't either. But we can't stop, not now. We just need to do it together." He nodded slowly, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. "Together. Then, but smart, no reckless moves." "Agreed," she said, her own smile faint but real. The next day, they stood shoulder to shoulder on the steps of City Hall, facing a throng of reporters and supporters. The wind whipped through the crowd, carrying the faint scent of rain as Rachel's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "This isn't about one moment, one officer, or one department. It's about a system that's rotting at its core, and it's about people standing up to demand better. We won't stop until change is real." Daniel took the mic next, his tone steady and resolute. "We're calling on leaders here in Hartford and beyond to listen, to act, to hold power accountable. This fight belongs to all of us." The crowd roared, their energy a balm to Rachel's weary spirit. For the first time in days, she felt the weight lift, if only a little. Their resolve only grew as the days passed, their voices amplified by a swelling tide of public support. In Hartford's Central Square, a protest bloomed, a peaceful sea of hundreds clutching signs that read "Justice for Rachel" and "Reform Now." Chants of no justice, no peace rolled through the streets, bouncing off the gray stone buildings that loomed overhead. Rachel and Daniel stood at the edge, watching the crowd with a mix of awe and determination. Nearby, a smaller knot of counter-protesters waved signs of their own support the police. "Cops' lives matter," their shouts clashing with the larger chorus. Barriers kept the groups apart, but the air crackled with the unspoken threat of escalation, a reminder that justice came at a cost, and those who abused power would cling to it until the end. The air in the square hung heavy with anticipation as the crowd gradually hushed, their murmurs fading into a tense stillness. Daniel stood at the podium, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone, the faint screech of feedback cutting through the quiet. His gaze swept over the sea of faces before him, some weary, some defiant, all waiting. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and let his eyes linger on Rachel, his wife, who stood just off to the side. She was a pillar of strength, her chin lifted high despite the weight of everything she'd endured. "My wife, Rachel," he began, his voice ringing out clear and forceful, slicing through the thick atmosphere, stood tall in the face of injustice. She refused to let her voice be smothered, refused to bow to a system that tried to erase her. "And it's because of her unshakable courage that we're all gathered here today." His words ignited a spark in the crowd, a ripple of nods and murmurs of agreement swelling into cheers. "But this isn't just her battle," he pressed on, his tone deepening with conviction. "This fight belongs to every single one of you who's ever been overlooked, hunted down, or cast aside by a system that's cracked and crumbling. A system that's failed us all." The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of applause and shouts crashing through the square, a raw outpouring of support that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Daniel's chest tightened with emotion as he watched the energy surge, but he wasn't done. His voice grew fiercer, each word a hammer striking steel. "We're not here to tear each other apart," he declared, leaning forward, his hands gripping the podium's edges. "We're here to demand that those in power answer for what they've done. We're here to shout loud and clear that no badge pinned to a chest, no fancy title scribbled on a door, no seat of authority gives anyone the right to act like they're above us, untouchable." His eyes blazed as he scanned the crowd, meeting their gazes one by one. "We deserve better, not just for Rachel, not just for me, but for every soul who dares to call this city home." The roar that followed was deafening, a unified cry that rolled like thunder, vibrating through the concrete and steel of the urban sprawl around them. For a moment, it felt unbreakable, A shared heartbeat pulsing through hundreds of strangers brought together by a single cause. But that unity was fragile, a thread stretched too thin from the far side of the square. Beyond the flimsy metal barriers separating the groups, a counter-protest reared its head. A lone voice, sharp and venomous, sliced through the chants like a blade. "Why don't you take your fancy money and get out of our city? Leave us alone." The insult landed like a stone in still water, ripples of tension spreading fast. A few protesters near the front spun around, their faces twisting with indignation. "You're the problem," one bellowed back, his voice raw with frustration. Fists clenched at his sides. The exchange lit a match. Within seconds, the air thickened with hostility as shouts volleyed back and forth, growing uglier with every word. Insults replaced reason, and the berishmian to keep order began to wobble as bodies pressed against them from both sides. A restless tide threatening to spill over. The police, stationed like sentinels along the square's edges, didn't hesitate. Officers clad in riot gear, their faces obscured behind visors, moved with practiced precision, forming a human wall between the clashing groups. Sunlight glinted off their polished shields, casting sharp reflections onto the pavement. "Everyone, step back," an officer's voice boomed through a megaphone, amplified and commanding. Cutting through the rising din, "Maintain your distance, or we will intervene." The warning hung in the air, heavy and ominous, but Daniel refused to let it drown out the purpose of the day. Still at the podium, he raised his hands high, palms out, a gesture of peace amid the storm. "Please, everyone," he called, his voice steady but pleading. "Stay calm. Keep this peaceful. Don't let them pull us away from why we're here." His words carried weight, a lifeline thrown to a crowd teetering on the edge. Many Listoned protesters near the barriers stepped back, their signs drooping slightly as they exhaled their anger, choosing restraint over chaos. Not everyone heard him, though. A knot of young men, their faces half hidden by hoods and bandanas, lingered at the front, defiance etched into their postures. One of them barely more than a kid. His eyes wild with adrenaline, cocked his arm back and hurled a glass bottle. It arched through the air, a fleeting glint in the sunlight, before shattering on the pavement inches from an officer's boots, shards skittering across the ground. The response was swift and merciless. The police line surged forward, batons raised like extensions of their arms. As more objects, water bottles, soda cans, even jagged rocks flew from the crowd in a reckless barrage. Rachel, standing just behind Daniel, couldn't hold back any longer. "Stop," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation, nearly swallowed by the swelling chaos. "This isn't what we're about." Daniel seized the microphone again, yanking it close, his knuckles whitening around it. "This is not the way," he roared, his voice straining to rise above the clamor. "If you're here to stir up trouble, you're not with us, you're against us." But the situation was slipping beyond his grasp, a runaway train careening off its tracks, the clash between the police and the handful of agitators, those few who'd chosen violence, over purpose as willowed the peaceful majority whole. Tear gas canisters hissed as they launched into the air, bursting into thick, choking clouds that sent people scrambling, coughing, and clutching their faces. The square dissolved into madness, a blur of running figures and panicked shouts. Rachel and Daniel retreated, their security team closing ranks around them like a shield. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket, texts from allies, frantic calls from reporters, but she barely registered it. Her hands shook as she brushed a strand of hair from her sweat-streaked face, frustration carving deep lines across her brow. "This is exactly what they wanted," she muttered, her voice low and bitter, almost lost to the wind. "They'll twist this, use it to paint us as the villains, to bury everything we're fighting for." Daniel's hand found her shoulder, warm and steady, grounding her in the storm. "We'll get ahead of it," he said, his tone unyielding despite the exhaustion creeping into his eyes. "But first, we need to make sure no one's hurt worse than they already are." As the square slowly emptied, the aftermath came into focus. Several protesters sat in cuffs, their heads bowed as officers led them away. Paramedics darted through the thinning crowd, tending to scrape knees and tear-streaked faces, their neon vests stark against the gray pavement. News crews swarmed like vultures, cameras zeroing in on every arrest, every clash. their lenses hungry for the next headline. Already, the story was fracturing. On one channel, a pundit's voice dripped with disdain. What began as a noble call for justice has spiraled into chaos. Is this what reform looks like? But on another, an activist pushed back. Her words sharp and urgent. This was the work of a few troublemakers. The vast majority stood for peace, and their demand for change still echoes loud and clear. The system has to answer for itself. Later that evening, Rachel and Daniel faced the press in a dimly lit room. The hum of cameras and rustle of notepads filling the space. Rachel stepped to the podium first. Her shoulders squared despite the weariness tugging at her frame. Her eyes, though shadowed with fatigue, burned with resolve. Today's protest was about unity and accountability, she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Unfortunately, a small group chose to drown that message in violence. Let me be crystal clear. Those actions don't speak for us. We stand for justice, not destruction. Daniel took her place, his presence steady and commanding. The real story isn't the chaos a few caused, he said, his voice firm, each word deliberate. It's the thousands who showed up, who raised their voices together, demanding something better. We won't let anyone derail this movement, not now, not ever. Behind closed doors, the city's leadership scrambled to keep up. The mayor's office buzzed with ringing phones, aides fielding furious calls from citizens who wanted answers. We had the police come down so hard. And why hadn't the city stopped this from boiling over? Meanwhile, Chief Karen Monroe sat in her office, her jaw tight as she pored over reports, preparing for what lay ahead, the disciplinary hearing for Officer Mike Callahan. The timing couldn't have been worse. With the city still reeling from the day's upheaval, the hearing loomed like a thundercloud, a moment that would either prove Hartford's resolve to uphold justice or expose its cowardice. In the face of power, the hearing room was a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension as rows of officers, city officials, and community leaders filed in. Their faces told a story of their own, some taut with anticipation, others clouded with unease, a few simmering with quiet anger. At the front, Mike Callahan sat stiffly, his usual uniform swapped for a crisp suit that felt foreign against his skin. His expression was a fortress, defiance locked into every line of his face. Though his hands betrayed him, fidgeting faintly in his lap, across the table sat the review panel, led by Chief Karen Monroe, her posture ramrod straight, her dark eyes unwavering. Flanking her were legal reps and members of the Civilian Oversight Committee, their notepads open and pens poised. Officer Callahan, Monroe began, her voice calm but edged with steel. You're here today to account for your actions in the incident involving Rachel Carter. This panel will sift through the evidence, hear from witnesses, and decide if disciplinary measures up to and including your termination are justified. Mike gave a curt nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. Beside him sat David Trent, his lawyer, a sleek, sharp-dressed man with slick-back hair and a reputation for turning high-stakes cases into spectacles. Trent leaned forward, his voice smooth as polished glass, but laced with a quiet menace. This is nothing but a circus, he said, gesturing broadly. My client's being strung up as a scapegoat to quiet a loud minority. Officer Callahan was doing his job, enforcing the law, and any claim to the contrary is a baseless smear. Monroe didn't blink. The evidence will tell its own story, she replied coolly, nodding to the Oversight Committee's legal counsel. The room fell silent as the first exhibit flickered onto a screen of video that had already seared itself into the public's mind. The panel watched, unblinking, as the grainy footage unfolded, Mike towering over Rachel, his movements brusque as he snatched her work permit and ripped it apart with a flick of his wrist, his sneer unmistakable as he brushed off her protests. The scene shifted as arm shot out toward a bystander filming the encounter, a flash of aggression that made the room's tension spike. When the screen went dark, a panelist leaned forward, her voice piercing. Do you deny what we just saw, Officer Callahan? Mike cleared his throat, the sound rough in the stillness. No, he said, his tone tight, clipped, but context matters. I was following orders regulations in a high-crime zone. Her paperwork looked off, and I reacted how I was trained. Another panelist cut in, her words sharp as a whip, You destroyed a legal document. What gave you that authority? Mike faltered, his eyes darting to Trent, who slid in seamlessly. Let's not pretend officers don't make split-second calls every day, Trent said, his voice a velvet blade. My client acted in the heat of the moment, under pressure. That's the job. The hearing stretched on, each testimony peeling back layers of a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about one man's actions, but about a system that too often shielded the powerful and crushed the vulnerable. For Rachel, for Daniel, for the city watching with bated breath, it was a lesson carved in fireabyss of power carried a cost, and the fight to hold it accountable was a flame that wouldn't die. In the suffocating heat of a Hartford hearing room, tension coiled like a spring ready to snap. Officer Mike Callahan sat rigid, his broad shoulders hunched under the weight of scrutiny, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might crack. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not from the temperature, but from the relentless gaze of Chief Monroe, whose sharp eyes cut through the haze of excuses like a blade. She leaned forward in her chair, her posture exuding authority, her voice steady, but laced with an undercurrent of disbelief. The video evidence is crystal clear, she said, her words deliberate, each one landing like a hammer. There's no trace of fraud in that document. What it does show is a flagrant violation of due process, a complete disregard for the protocols you swore to uphold. How do you explain that, Officer Callahan? Mike's attorney, Trent, a weary man with a slick suit and a sharper tongue, shifted in his seat, his mind racing for a foothold in the crumbling defense. He'd coached Mike for this moment, but the officer's composure was fraying. Mike's hands balled into fists beneath the table, his knuckles whitening as he wrestled with the urge to lash out. He'd always seen himself as a protector, a man who stood between order and chaos in a city that teetered on the edge. Now, every eye in the room painted him as the villain, and the sting of that betrayal burned deeper than he'd admit. The hearing rolled on, and the testimonies began to pour in like a flood breaching a dam. Bystanders, ordinary people who'd been at the plaza that day, stepped forward, their voices trembling with a mix of fear and conviction. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a faded coat clutched her purse as she spoke. Rachel Carter wasn't doing a thing wrong, she said, her tone firm despite the quiver in her hands. She was just standing there, talking to someone, calm as could be. Then her came at her like she was some kind of threat, like she'd pulled a gun instead of a word. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. Another witness, a young man with a skateboard tucked under his arm, nodded vigorously. Yeah, he acted like he owned the place. She didn't even raise her voice, and he's yelling, shoving. It was messed up. Mike squirmed in his chair, the wooden seat creaking under his shifting weight. Each story tightened the noose around his neck, stripping away the image he'd built over to decades of service. He wasn't a bully, he told himself, was enforcing the law, keeping the public safe. But the footage didn't lie, and neither did the witnesses. Their words wove a tapestry of aggression, not duty, and it was suffocating him. Trent leapt to his feet, his voice rising in a desperate bid to shift the narrative. Let's not gloss over the bigger picture here, he argued, pacing before the panel with the confidence of a man who thrived on chaos. Rachel Carter and her husband, Daniel, aren't exactly saints. They've got money, influence, to twist this whole thing into a circus. This isn't about justice, it's about power. They've turned a single incident into a media frenzy to push their own agenda. You can't ignore that. His words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, but they landed on deaf ears. In the audience, Daniel Carter sat with his fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks. Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior, a storm held back by sheer will. Beside him, Rachel rested a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm, a silent plea for restraint. Her face was a mask of resolve, her eyes locked on the proceedings with an intensity that could have melted steel. She wasn't here to cower or crumble, she was here to fight. The panel remained unmoved. A stern woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor leaned into her microphone, her voice cutting through Trent's bluster. Even if there's truth to what you're implying, it doesn't change the facts, she said. This hearing isn't about the Carters' motives, it's about Officer Callahan's actions. His conduct is what's on trial here, not their character. Her words were a lifeline for Rachel and a death knell for Mike. Trent, undeterred, pivoted with the agility of a cornered animal. "Fine," he snapped, his tone dripping with frustration. "If we're going to dissect my client's every move, let's talk about the system he works in." Officer Callahan was following policies set by this very administration. You want accountability? Look higher up the chain. The problem starts with the department, not just one man. He shot a pointed glance at Chief Monroe, daring her to take the bait. The chief's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This isn't a game of deflection, counselor," she said, her voice cold as ice. "We're here to determine what happened in that plaza, who's responsible and why. Stay on task." Her authority filled the room, a force that brooked no argument. As the hours dragged on, the evidence against Mike piled higher, an avalanche he couldn't outrun. The final blow came when an internal review was unveiled. Its findings laid bare like a wound torn open. Complaints against him stretched back years, allegations of excessive force, racial bias, patterns of aggression that painted a picture far uglier than a single bad day. Most had been swept under the rug, dismissed without so much as a cursory glance. But the sheer volume was undeniable now. A panel member, his face etched with disappointment, addressed Mike directly. "Officer Callahan, this isn't an isolated misstep. Your record shows a consistent disregard for fairness, for respect, very principles this department stands for. How do you reconcile that?" Mike's facade shattered. He surged to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. 20 years, he roared, his voice raw with indignation. "I've given this city 20 damn years, put my life on the line more times than you can count. And this is what I get for doing my job." His chest heaved, his eyes wild with a mix of fury and desperation. Chief Monroe didn't flinch. "You weren't doing your job," she said, her tone unyielding. "You were abusing your power, and now you'll answer for it." Her words were a guillotine, and the panel's verdict fell swift and unanimous. Mike Callahan was terminated, effective immediately. The room erupted in murmurs, a low hum of shock and satisfaction rippling through the crowd. Trent shoved papers into his briefcase, his movements jerky with frustration. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. "We'll appeal." But the panel wasn't done. They escalated the matter, referring Mike's case to the district attorney for potential charges: destruction of legal documents, misconduct under color of law. The weight of it crushed him as he stormed out, his face a storm cloud of rage and disbelief. Passing Rachel and Daniel, he paused, his gaze locking with hers. She didn't blink, didn't waver. Her steady stare bore into him, a silent declaration. This is justice. Days later, Rachel Carter stood before a sea of microphones, her legal team flanking her like sentinels. The lawsuit she'd filed against Mike Callahan and the Hartford Police Department wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was a Molotov cocktail lobbed at a broken system. "This isn't about one rogue officer," she said, her voice clear and unshaken. "It's about a culture that shields misconduct, that buries accountability under layers of bureaucracy. That ends now." The suit demanded damages, yes, but its heart was reform, independent oversight, mandatory training, a complete overhaul of a disciplinary process rotten to its core. Daniel stood beside her, his broad frame a pillar of quiet strength. "Rachel's not doing this for us," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion simmering beneath. "Any money we get goes straight to groups fighting for civil rights, for police reform. This is about justice for everyone who's suffered under this system, not just us." His words carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much, who'd felt the sting of power unchecked. The city fought back, their attorneys scrambling to contain the fallout. This was one man acting alone, their lead counsel insisted in court, his tone polished but hollow. "The department isn't liable for an individual's choices, but Rachel's team, led by the fierce Cynthia Ross, tore that defense apart. We have records," Cynthia said, her voice a whip crack. Callahan was reprimanded time and again, complaints of misconduct ignored, buried. This isn't one bad apple, it's a diseased tree, and the department knew it. The tide turned when leaked documents surfaced, exposing the rot within. Memos showed complaints dismissed without a second thought. Officers with histories of violence shuffled around like pieces on a chessboard. One note, scrawled by a senior official, read like a confession: "Keep this quiet, it'll look bad." Outside the courthouse, Protests swelled, voices rising in a chorus of no more cover-ups. And reform now, the city buckled under the pressure, offering a settlement millions to make it go away. Rachel and Daniel didn't hesitate. "Not a cent stays with us," Daniel said on Live TV. "It's all for the fight against racial profiling, police brutality, systemic failure." The money flowed to civil rights groups, local organizers, people bridging the chasm between cops and communities. But the story didn't end there. The lawsuit cracked open a door, and a state task force stormed through, digging into years of Hartford PD records. What they found was staggering. Over 60% of complaints from minorities tossed aside. Officers shielded from consequences. The lesson was brutal and clear. Justice isn't just a verdict, it's a reckoning. Power, when twisted, breeds ruin, and only relentless accountability can right the scales. For Mike, for Rachel, for a city on edge, the consequences echoed far beyond that hearing room. A warning carved in stone: abuse authority, and the fall will be steep. In the shadowed corners of Hartford, where whispers of injustice had long festered, a storm was brewing gone that would shake the city to its foundations. For years, officers with tarnished records, their files thick with infractions, weren't cast aside or reprimanded as they should have been. Instead, they climbed the ranks or shuffled to new posts, their misdeeds trailing behind them like a dark shadow. Worse still, when force was wielded, it landed hardest on Black and Hispanic residents, a bitter truth that gnawed at the city's soul. When these ugly revelations burst into the open, they ignited a firestorm of public fury. The people's voices rose, not as a plea, but as a thunderous demand for justice, echoing through the packed chamber of a city council meeting that crackled with tension. The room was a sea of faces: residents and activists pressed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes blazing with years of pent-up frustration. One speaker, a weary man with a voice that trembled not from fear but from raw emotion, stepped forward. "We're done with empty words," he declared, his hands clenched into fists as if gripping the last threads of his patience. "We don't just want promises to soothe us, we want action. Fire the ones who've stained this department, rip out the rot, and rebuild it from the ashes." His words hung heavy in the air, met with a roar of agreement that reverberated off the walls. Chief Karen Monroe stood before the council, a woman weathered by the weight of her role. The lines on her face told stories of sleepless nights and battles fought within the precinct's walls. She could feel the heat of every gaze boring into her, the unspoken accusations pressing against her chest. "This department has stumbled, failed in ways I can't deny," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet shame. "But I refuse to believe it's beyond saving. Today, we turn the page. Accountability will be our cornerstone, transparency our shield." Her admission drew a scattering of cautious claps, like raindrops hesitant to signal a storm's end. Yet the crowd's message was unmistakable. They'd be watching her every move, their trust a prize she'd have to claw her way toward. In the weeks that followed, the city began to shift, as if shaking off a long, restless slumber. Several senior officers, their names tangled in the investigation's web, saw the writing on the wall. Some resigned, heads bowed under the weight of disgrace. Others were shown the door, their exits swift and unceremonious. An independent oversight board sprang to life, a beacon of hope tasked with sifting through complaints that had once been buried in bureaucratic quicksand. Across the department, mandatory training sessions rolled out anti-bias lessons to unravel the threads of prejudice, de-escalation drills to temper the instinct for force. Rachel Carter and Daniel Ortiz, two unrelenting voices in the fray, refused to let the momentum falter. They tethered themselves to civil rights groups, their resolve a lifeline, keeping the reforms afloat. One humid evening, the pair sat in a community forum, the air thick with the scent of sweat and anticipation. A young woman rose, her frame slight but her presence commanding. Her voice quivered as she spoke of her brother, wrongfully arrested, his life upended by a system that saw him as a threat rather than a person. "I thought no one gave a damn," she said, tears carving paths down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she clutched the microphone. "But watching you to fight, it's like a flicker of light in all this dark." Rachel approached her after, her steps deliberate, her eyes soft with understanding. She rested a hand on the woman's shoulder, a gesture both gentle and firm. "This isn't just our battle," she murmured, her voice a quiet promise. "It's yours, too. Together we'll make them hear us." The woman nodded, a spark of hope igniting behind her tears. The fallout from Rachel's case was a seismic jolt, rattling Hartford's core. Evidence of systemic rot, decades of ignored complaints, patterns of brutality pulled high, fueling a rage that forced city leaders to act with a speed they'd rarely shown. Promises of reform, once hollow as a drum, now carried weight, backed by plans that could be measured and enforced. The Hartford Independent Oversight Commission (HIAC) emerged as the first bold step, a body woven from community leaders, legal minds, and ex-officers whose records gleamed with integrity. At its inaugural meeting, Chairwoman Linda Reyes stood tall, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We're here to rebuild trust," she said, her gaze sweeping over the attendants, some hopeful, some skeptical. "That starts with dragging the truth into the light. No more swept under the rug excuses, no more protecting the guilty." Her words landed like a gavel. And for the residents, who'd felt voiceless too long, it was a sound they'd craved. The commission wasted no time, diving into a backlog of complaints with a meticulous fury. Cases steeped in racial bias or excessive force rose to the top, each file a testament to pain that had been dismissed. Meanwhile, the police department rolled out anti-bias training, led by experts whose credentials spanned the nation. In one session, Officer Tom Bradley, a burly man with a furrowed brow, raised his hand, his tone blunt. "How are we supposed to do our jobs without every stop turning into an accusation of bias?" he asked, arms crossed, his frustration palpable. The instructor, a former cop turned advocate named Jamal Hayes, didn't flinch. "This isn't about dodging blame," he shot back, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's about doing what's right. If your actions hold up fair, just to feed truth will stand with you. But if you're picking targets by skin color, you've got no business wearing that badge." The room stilled, Bradley's jaw tightening as the lesson sank in. Beyond the precinct, the community stirred. Weekly town halls became a battleground of words, where officers and citizens faced off, sometimes with anger, sometimes with tentative hope. At one meeting, a young black man named Marcus stood, his voice a shaky threat of defiance. "How do we trust a system that's crushed us for generations?" he demanded, locking eyes with Chief Monroe. She didn't look away, her expression a mix of resolve and weariness. "Trust isn't handed over, it's forged," she replied. "I won't pretend it'll come fast, but every step we take is to prove this department can protect everyone, not just some." The crowd murmured, a blend of doubt and faint applause rippling through. It wasn't a victory, but it was a beginning. Change crept into the streets, too, with neighborhood policing programs taking root. Officer Erica Green, a rookie with deep ties to Hartford, found herself assigned to the very blocks where she'd once run as a kid. On her first patrol, she spotted a group of teens shooting hoops in a cracked park, their laughter cutting through the afternoon haze. "Mind if I take a shot?" she called, scooping up the ball with a grin. They eyed her warily. Uniforms rarely a welcome sight, but she persisted, and soon the ball was bouncing between them, their guarded stares softening. "Guess not all cops suck," one kid quipped, a smirk tugging at his lips as the others chuckled. It was a fleeting moment, but it hinted at what could be officers woven into the fabric of the places they served, not just enforcers passing through. Not everyone welcomed the tide of reform. Captain Ron Peterson, a grizzled veteran with a loyal following, bristled at the changes. At a tense meeting with city officials, he slammed his fist on the table, his voice a growl. "This department's bending over backwards for activists punishing us for doing our damn jobs." Councilwoman Maria Santos, a fierce champion of the overhaul, didn't hesitate. "What you call punishment, Captain, is accountability," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "If you can't tell the difference, maybe you're the problem we're trying to fix." The air thickened with silence, Peterson's face reddening as her words struck home. Resistance lingered, but it wouldn't derail the mission. The reforms stretched beyond the badge, seeping into Hartford's schools and streets. Anti-racism workshops armed teachers with new tools, while grants fueled youth programs aimed at breaking cycles of violence. One initiative, led by ex-gang member Jamal Carter, shone bright. At a city event honoring its success, he took the stage, his voice thick with pride and pain. "I was one of those kids convinced the deck was stacked against me, and I wasn't wrong," he said, scanning the crowd. "But now we've got a shot to rewrite the rules for us for them." He pointed to the teens in the front row, their eyes wide with possibility. For Rachel and Daniel, the victories were laced with a quiet ache. At a press conference 6 months after the lawsuit's settlement, Rachel faced a swarm of reporters, her voice steady but her heart heavy. "Real change isn't a sprint, it's a marathon," she said, the weight of every fight etched into her words. "Hartford's showing it can be done, but it's on all of us to keep running." The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just a gift to be claimed, it was a fire to be tended. A warning to those who'd wield power without care. The city had cracked open, and from its wounds, something stronger was taking root. In the quiet aftermath of their struggle, Daniel Carter stood resolute, his voice cutting through the air like a beacon of unwavering determination. "This isn't the end," he declared, his tone thick with conviction. "It's only the beginning of a much larger fight." His words weren't just a statement, they were a spark, igniting a fire within the hearts of those who had gathered around him. The community, once fractured by distrust and apathy, now pulsed with a renewed sense of purpose, their collective energy surging as they rallied behind the Carters' call to action. Hartford, a city teetering on the edge of transformation, began to shift towards something greater, something built on the fragile, yet fierce hope of progress. Meanwhile, a starkly different fate unfolded for Mike Callahan, a man whose life crumbled under the weight of his own choices, serving as a grim testament to the ruin that follows when power is wielded without restraint. For Mike Callahan, the unraveling came swiftly and mercilessly. Once a towering figure in the Hartford Police Department, his name now splashed across headlines in a way that twisted his stomach into knots. His dismissal wasn't just a bureaucratic decision, it was a public spectacle. A fall from grace that echoed through the city like a thunderclap. The newsreels replayed his misdeeds on a loop, branding him with a notoriety he couldn't escape. Inside the precinct, the camaraderie he'd once taken for granted dissolved like mist in the morning sun. Colleagues who had shared late-night coffee runs and swapped stories of the beat now turned their backs, their eyes averted as if his shame might somehow taint them too. They weren't willing to gamble their own fragile standings for a man who'd crossed a line they all knew was sacred. Mike felt the sting of their rejection deep in his chest, a wound that festered with every cold glance and every hushed whisper. Beyond the station, the world he'd once navigated with confidence morphed into a maze of judgment. In the grocery store, where he used to exchange pleasantries with cashiers, he now heard murmurs trailing him down the iceless oft. Cutting words like "that's the guy who shredded her papers." At the gas station, where he'd once tipped his cap to familiar faces, a stranger's voice rang out just loud enough to pierce his armor, disgrace to the badge. Even the dim-lit bars, those sanctuaries where he'd unwound after grueling shifts, turned hostile. The clink of glasses and low hum of conversation would halt as he entered, replaced by stares that bore into him like accusations carved in stone. At first, Mike's temper flared, a simmering rage bubbling beneath his weathered skin. He'd clench his fists, his jaw tight, ready to snap back at the world that dared to judge him. But as days bled into weeks, that fire dimmed, extinguished by a suffocating truth. He was utterly, irrevocably alone. The financial toll hit like a second blow, relentless and unforgiving. Without his badge, the steady paycheck vanished, and the legal battles drained what little he'd tucked away. Disciplinary hearings chewed through his savings, and the civil lawsuit loomed like a storm cloud, its demands piling up alongside the unpaid bills cluttering his kitchen table. Job hunting became a humiliating ritual of rejection. At one interview, a blunt manager squinted at him across a cluttered desk and said, "Your name's been all over the news, Callahan. We can't touch that kind of heat." Even the lowliest gig security guard at a strip mall, night watchman at a warehouse slipped through his fingers. No one called back. No one wanted the baggage he carried. Desperation crept in, a cold shadow that settled into his bones. One night, hunched over that table littered with overdue notices, he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse with resentment, "This isn't right. I did my job. I followed the damn rules." They're the ones who screwed me. But the words felt hollow, a flimsy shield against the reality closing in. That bitterness soon curdled into something darker, a venomous obsession that fixed its sights on Rachel and Daniel Carter. In Mike's fractured mind, they weren't just adversaries, they were the architects of his destruction. Late at night, when the world quieted and his apartment grew stifling, he'd hunch over his laptop, bloodshot eyes scanning articles about their rising influence. Each headline stoked the embers of his fury. Local activists lead police reform efforts. Hartford couple inspires national change. They made me the bad guy, he'd growl, slamming the screen shut with a force that rattled the room. They tore my life apart. One evening, after too many whiskeys burned their way down his throat, he found himself behind the wheel, the engines hum a dull roar beneath his racing thoughts. He drove toward the Carters' neighborhood, the streets blurring past as his anger steered him closer. Their house came into view, its warm, glowing windows a cruel mockery of the cold void swallowing his own existence. He parked a few houses down, his hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel, his mind a storm of impulses he knew he shouldn't indulge. Before he could decide, a blinding beam sliced through the night, a security patrol's flashlight, pinning him in its glare. The officer stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice steady but edged with authority. Mike's pulse hammered in his ears. "Just lost," he stammered, fumbling the car into gear and peeling away. The encounter a splinter under his skin. Word reached Daniel by morning, and he didn't hesitate. "Watch him closely," he told their security team, his jaw set with quiet resolve. "If he tries anything, we go straight to the police." For Mike, the incident was just one more thread unraveling in the tapestry of his life. The district attorney's office tightened the noose, charging him with destruction of legal documents and abuse of power. His lawyer, a weary man with tired eyes, wrangled a plea deal, fines and community service instead of bars. But the punishment stung worse than jail might have. For a man who'd once worn the badge with pride, scrubbing graffiti off a wall in the very streets he used to patrol was a slow, public bleed. During one of those shifts, a group of teenagers sauntered by, their laughter slicing through the humid air. One of them, a lanky kid with a smirk, paused and pointed. "Hey, aren't you that cop who got canned?" The words landed like a punch, and Mike's knuckles whitened around the brush, but he said nothing. The shame seared through him, a fire he couldn't douse. Isolation became his constant companion. Friends faded into silence. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid him, and even his familiance, his anchor, drifted away. His sister, Sarah, had stood by him at first, her loyalty a fragile lifeline. But one night, in the cramped heat of his apartment, that thread snapped. "You did this to yourself, Mike," she said, her voice sharp with frustration, her hazel eyes flashing with a mix of anger and pity. "Stop pointing fingers and look at what you've done." He erupted, his temper a volcano spilling over. "You don't get it. They framed me. They turned everyone against me." Sarah's face softened, but her words cut deeper. "No, Mike, you did that. You ripped up her papers. You chose that path." She left him there, her parting words echoing in the stale air, prying loose the bricks of denial he'd stacked around himself. In the weeks that followed, Mike spiraled into an abyss of his own making. Nights blurred into days, fueled by cheap liquor and aimless drifting. His apartment became a tomb, its walls closing in as he rarely ventured out except to replenish his supply. The weight of his disgrace pressed down, a relentless force that smothered what little fight he had left. One evening, slumped in the dark, the TV flickered to life with a news report. Rachel and Daniel filled the screen, their voices calm yet commanding as they spoke of Hartford's reforms. "This is just the start," Rachel said, her eyes blazing with purpose. "We've got a long road ahead, but justice is worth it." Mike stared, the rage that once defined him now a faint echo, replaced by a hollow ache. They'd moved forward, forging meaning from the chaos he'd sown, while he remained trapped, a relic of his own ruin. For the first time, he let the truth seep in. This wasn't their doing. It was his. Across town, Rachel and Daniel poured their souls into a cause that transcended their pain. The auditorium thrummed with restless energy, hundreds of voices blending into a low roar as activists, lawmakers, and citizens filled the seats. The National Conference on Police Reform had drawn eyes from coast to coast, and Rachel Carter stood at its heart, poised to speak. Backstage, Daniel watched her, his chest swelling with pride and a quiet strength. She'd borne their ordeal with a grace that humbled him, and now her words would ripple far beyond their city. As she stepped to the podium, the crowd erupted, a wave of applause crashing over her. She adjusted the microphone, her hands steadied despite the tremor of nerves beneath her skin, and met their gazes with a fire that refused to dim. "Good evening," she began, her voice a blend of steel and warmth. "When Daniel and I started this, we couldn't have imagined standing here. What happened to me wasn't rarite, was a symptom of a system that's crushed too many for too long. But what matters is what we've done with it." The room stilled, her words sinking into every corner. Injustice festers in silence, she pressed on, her tone rising with urgency. It thrives when we look away, but not anymore. Her speech was a clarion call, a reminder that justice isn't a gift, it's a fight. And as Mike's world crumbled under the consequences of his hubris, Rachel and Daniel built something enduring, proving that power abused brings ruin, while power challenged can birth redemption. The air buzzed with anticipation as Rachel Carter stood on the stage, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. She wasn't trembling from fear anymore, though the memory of that day in the plaza still lingered like a shadow in her mind. Her dark eyes scanned the sea of faces before her, men and women from every corner of life, their expressions a mix of hope, anger, and resolve. She took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the weight of their expectations settle on her shoulders. This wasn't about her alone anymore. It was about all of them, about the unspoken pact they'd forged in the face of a system that had silenced too many for too long. "I stood in that plaza," she began, her voice steady but laced with the raw edge of memory, "and I had a choice to make." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, her mind drifting back to that chaotic afternoon, the shouts, the sting of tear gas, the cold indifference of the officers who'd shoved her to the ground. It all flooded back. She could have let it break her. Anger had clawed at her chest, tempting her to lash out or retreat into bitterness. She could have taken the settlement money, signed the papers, and walked away, pretending it was enough. But deep inside, where her conscience burned like a quiet flame, she knew it wouldn't be. Not for her, not for the countless others whose stories had been buried under the weight of the same corrupt machinery. "I could have let it consume me," she continued, her gaze locking with a woman in the front row whose tired eyes mirrored her own. "I could have given up, told myself nothing would ever change. But I didn't. I chose to fight." Her voice grew stronger, rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "And what I discovered, what I felt, was that I wasn't alone." She gestured outward, her hands sweeping across the room as if to gather every soul into her embrace. "You were there with me. People from every walk of life, teachers, mechanics, mothers, students, standing shoulder to shoulder, demanding answers, demanding justice. That's the power we hold. That's the strength of community." Her words weren't just a story, they were a spark, igniting something fierce and unyielding in the hearts of those who listened. Rachel wasn't a victim recounting her pain, she was a force, a woman who'd turned her scars into a rallying cry. "The reforms in Hartford," she told them, "were only the first step. We've seen progress," she said, her tone softening as she thought of the late-night meetings, the stacks of reports, the slow grind of change. But progress is fragile. It's a flame that flickers in the wind, and it takes every one of us to shield it. It takes courage to stand up when the world tells you to sit down. It takes vigilance to keep pushing when the odds feel like mountains. She shifted her stance, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the policymakers seated in the back, their suits crisp and their faces unreadable. Her voice hardened, cutting through the room like a blade. "To those with power, I'm speaking to you now. Don't just hear you, listen. Don't just promise us a better tomorrow, build it. Because the price of doing nothing, of letting injustice fester, is a debt we'll all pay. And trust me, it's steeper than any challenge you'll face in fixing this." A ripple of tension passed through the crowd, but then it broke into a wave of applause, loud and unrelenting, as if the room itself couldn't contain their agreement. Rachel wasn't done. She turned her attention to the quiet ones, The skeptics who sat with crossed arms or downcast eyes, the ones who felt small against the towering systems they despised. And to those who think their voices don't matter, she said, her tone lifting, carrying a fire that refused to be dimmed, hear me now, you are the bedrock of this fight. Every sign you hold at a protest, every word you speak to a friend, every ballot you cast it builds something unstoppable. Together, we are a tide they can't hold back. The room erupted again, louder this time, and the sound crashed over her like a storm. She stepped back from the podium, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breath. The applause wasn't just noisy, it was a living thing, a chorus of belief and defiance. Then Daniel was there, striding across the stage with that quiet strength she'd always leaned on. He took her hand, his grip warm and firm, and they faced the crowd together. His presence grounded her, a reminder of the nights they'd spent plotting and dreaming, the arguments and the tears, the shared certainty that this was bigger than them both. That night, as they left the venue, the city hummed with the echo of her words. Television screens flickered in living rooms and bars, replaying her speech with bold captions. Change is possible. Justice is possible. On social media, the hashtag #YourPowerImmunity surged like wildfire. Posts piling up with messages of hope, grainy photos of protest signs, and videos of strangers chanting her words in distant towns. Back in Hartford, the effects of their battle rippled outward. The Police Oversight Commission, once a hollow promise, now buzzed with activity. Reports of misconduct weren't just filed away, they were investigated. Officers who'd once swaggered with impunity now faced suspensions, even firings. Trust, fragile as it was, began to take root. At neighborhood meetings, uniformed men and women sat awkwardly among residents, their notebooks open, their mouths shut, listening as people spoke of fears and frustrations they'd held for years. A woman who'd once crossed the street to avoid a patrol car now lingered to ask questions, her voice tentative but growing bolder with every word. One humid evening, at a community barbecue, a small boy with wide eyes and a mop of curls shuffled up to Rachel. He clutched a crumpled piece of paper in his fist, his sneakers scuffing the dirt. "Are you the lady from TV?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel knelt down, the grass cool against her knees, and offered him a smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I am," she said gently. "What's your name?" "Marcus," he mumbled, thrusting the paper toward her. It was a drawing to stick figures on a stage, one with long hair and a microphone, the other standing tall beside her. Rachel's breath caught, her throat tightening as she traced the shaky lines with her fingertip. "This is beautiful, Marcus," she managed, her voice thick. "Thank you." He beamed, then darted back to his friends, leaving her kneeling there, the paper trembling in her hands. It was a quiet moment, but it roared with meaning. This was why she'd fought, not just for herself, not just for now, but for kids like Marcus, for a world where they'd never have to fear the people meant to protect them. Months later, the invitation came, a roundtable at the White House, a chance to sit with lawmakers and advocates from across the country. Rachel and Daniel walked the marble halls, their footsteps echoing, their exhaustion warring with a stubborn flicker of hope. In the meeting, a senator with silver hair and a skeptical frown leaned toward Rachel. "What's the biggest lesson from Hartford?" he asked, his pen poised over a notepad. She didn't flinch. "That change begins when people stop swallowing their silence," she said, her voice clear and unflinching. "It's slow, it's messy, and it's hard as hell. But when we stand together, even the deepest roots of injustice can be pulled up." That evening, back in Hartford, they sat on their porch, the city sprawling before them like a quilt of lights and shadows. Daniel turned to her, his eyes soft in the dim glow. "You've become a symbol, you know," he said, his voice low and proud. Rachel shook her head, her lips curving into a tired smile. "I don't want that," she replied, leaning against the railing. "I want to be part of something that outlives USA movement, that keeps growing, keeps fighting." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You are," he said simply, and she knew he was right. Their story wasn't just about that day in the plaza or the speech that shook a nation. It was about the slow, stubborn power of people refusing to bend. It was about justice not as a distant dream, but as a fire stoked by unity, a flame that burned brighter with every voice that joined it. It was a lesson carved deep. When power is abused, when trust is shattered, the consequences ripple far beyond the guilty. But when people rise together, those ripples can become a wave, washing away what's broken and leaving room for something better. Rachel and Daniel Carter didn't just fight for Hartford, they lit a torch for anyone willing to carry it. And in the end, that was the truest measure of their victory.